Okay, we're recording.
All right, well, welcome everyone to today's Sustainable Change Alliance conversation, Ocean Health Threats, Opportunities, and Solutions. My name's Laura Francis, and I'm a marine educator, philanthropist, and impact investor. And I'm also a former board member and former board member of SCA and current member of the SCA Foundation. So for those of you who don't know, Sustainable Change Alliance is an impact-oriented, member-based, not-for-profit educational group focused on impact investing, which we define as bringing financial and other resources to double and triple bottom line organizations that are trying to address big social, environmental, or health-related issues, and trying to do that in a sustainable manner. Some of those organizations are for-profit, and some of them are nonprofit, and some come from the independent sector. I'd like to acknowledge the hardworking and dedicated SCA board members in the meeting and express gratitude for all of the members on this call. And finally, we couldn't do any of this without our sponsors. Our founding sponsors are Argyle Capital Partners, Impact Family Office, Maps.com, and UBS. Our platinum sponsor is Nixon Peabody Law Firm, and our silver sponsor is Brashears Insurance. If you're not yet a member of Sustainable Change Alliance Foundation, we encourage you or your organization to join us on this journey, and you can find out more at sustainablechangealliance.org, where you can sign up. And just a quick note on logistics today. This meeting's being recorded, and everyone is on mute except for the guest speakers and myself. And the chat room is how you'll have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. And hopefully there'll be lots of great questions today because we've got some wonderful speakers. And so the focus of our conversation today is around the ocean, which truly is the lifeblood of our planet. And I feel incredibly fortunate to have 4 of my esteemed colleagues here who are all global leaders in marine science. And they're going to share some of their insights and some of the big challenges and opportunities in supporting ocean health. And so for me, I've been passionate about the ocean since I was 11 years old, when I was fortunate enough to be in elementary school here in Santa Barbara and had the opportunity to go out on a trip to the Channel Islands with my 6th grade class. And when divers brought up a teeny little shark wriggling around in an egg case and showed it to me, I was hooked, and that was it. So I'm really lucky to have been able to spend the last 30 years of my career focused around the ocean, from studying hydrothermal vents 4,000 meters deep on the seafloor in graduate school to monitoring our local kelp forests right here in our backyard in Santa Barbara. I've been a high school teacher, and I've worked at the Channel Islands National Park and Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. And more recently, I've had the really good fortune to become an impact investor and philanthropist with a focus on a healthy, sustainable ocean. And I'm always seeking to learn more and share more on this journey. And about a year ago, I worked with the Bren School and with SCA to help put together an event called Reversing the Tide that was for members of the tonic community, which is a global action network for impact investors. Some of you may be familiar with it. The event was at Ucsb, and it was attended by entrepreneurs, philanthropists, and impact investors. And I know some of you here enjoyed that. It was incredibly inspiring, and it's led to the creation of an ocean focus group with Tonic, with members from all around the globe. And I've learned from my relatively short time in the investing world that impact investors really do want to make a tangible difference to try to really support the health of the ocean, but many of them don't know what the biggest problems and challenges are, or really where the biggest opportunities are. And so because of this, I've been really drawn to the idea of bringing experts in the field and all of these different areas of expertise together to have conversations about this and hopefully learn from each other and be able to make meaningful, positive, and lasting change. So you may or may not know that in addition to the year of COVID and the year of wildfires, 2021 has been designated as the year of the ocean. And it's also the kickoff for the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And so really now is the time for all of us to embrace and take bold, transformative action for the ocean and for ocean health and sustainability. So I hope you will all join me in that. And that leads me to our panel. And each speaker will share a bit about their personal connection to the ocean and provide some insight on what some of the challenges are and how we can support positive change for the ocean. And so we're going to go ahead and start with our first speaker today, who's Doug McCauley, the director of the Benioff Ocean Initiative and associate professor at UCSB.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you for sharing your story. It is so much more special, your connection to the ocean story, just because you can only imagine the number of students you put wriggling sharks in front of over the years, and probably have them in our classes here at UCSB or otherwise influencing positively a future of the ocean. So 2 emoji thumbs up, wherever that option is here on the screen. My own personal connection to oceans, I mean, I think like many who will share today, early and powerful connections to the ocean since I was a kid, sort of having the privilege of growing up in LA and finding on sort of one part of my world nothing but concrete and city, and the other part of my world nothing but wildness and diversity and adventure. Naturally, I was attracted to go jump in the ocean and explore it and figure out. My first job was working as a fisherman on the oceans at 14, where I was paid 50 cents for every fish that I was able to clean, to fillet on the boats. Nothing makes you more invested in oceans and their health than getting paid 50 cents for every fish that you can find in the sea. I'm obviously doing something different professionally now at the oceans, but that sort of early journey of trying to figure out how in the world do the oceans work, unlock that big mystery that for me remains the oceans, is still what I'm doing in science, but using a different set of tools to sort of unlock that big old ocean mystery. So I wanted to sort of set the tone for the conversation with some really wonderful colleagues to share thoughts on ocean opportunities, ocean challenges, ocean solutions, on the note of laying out in front of us clearly what the value is, what the many values are for our ocean. And that's the subject of a 5-day UCSB lecture, Values of the Oceans, but we'll condense it down to a minute or two here, simply because I think intuitively a lot of you already understand that there are diverse values, and many of them from the ocean. You can sort of begin or end a conversation about ocean values by simply breathing together. Every other breath we take is produced, the oxygen in that breath produced from the oceans, with about 50% of our oxygen generated from primary productivity that comes from the oceans. You sort of had me there, that the oceans were valuable, important, worth having these conversations about when we start talking about that contribution to global oxygen. But the values go on and on and on. We know that the ocean is a gigantic refrigerator that's full of nutritious free-range food. About 845 million people across the planet are kept just a step ahead of really awful diseases associated with malnutrition as a result of access to seafood that comes from a healthy ocean. If we were to treat the oceans as a state when doing our accounting, we would find an immense amount of economic value. They're a pillar in our global economy. It would rank about, if you treated them as a state, rank about the 7th largest economy in the world, just to give us a sense of really how much monetary economic value comes from the sea. Ocean-related tourism, if anyone remembers tourism, what that was, ocean-related tourism valued at $390 billion globally, and a whole lot of that value actually going to states and places that are less wealthy around our planet, places that actually use that cash to help meet development goals by sharing these wonderful biodiverse marine resources that they look after and are good stewards of. And the list goes on and on and on for values of protection. I just want to put one bookend on that list, which is that the oceans are pretty. And I don't think that that's something worth sweeping under the rug. That shark that was wriggling in front of Laura, you know, that inspirational value, that cultural connection, that historic value that comes to the oceans, those values are extremely important, on par with the trillions of dollars of actual revenue that comes from the sea. I think probably many of you, like me, continue to recharge daily in the oceans and learn an immense amount from the oceans simply by looking, experiencing, being literally immersed in its diversity and its bigness and its age. So another critically important package of values. So times are changing now, of course, that is an understatement for 2020, but times have been changing rapidly, land and sea, for an awfully long time on our planet. I think it's probably fair to say that change has occurred more radically, more rapidly, sooner on land than in the oceans. If you sort of think about, say, the Industrial Revolution on land, a period of rapid change that completely reformed our environment on our planet and reformed our relationship with our environment. Now that period began about the 1700s on land. That Industrial Revolution, that incredibly fast-paced change that reshaped our relationship with a huge part of our planet, hasn't really begun, or is really just beginning now in the oceans, the other 70-ish% of our planet, which is exciting because there's a whole lot of value and a whole lot of service, a whole lot of new products from energy to food that are coming out are associated with this acceleration of new human industry in our oceans. But there's a huge responsibility. I think when I mentioned the Industrial Revolution on land, we have this sort of visceral sense that things went right and a lot of things went wrong, particularly on the side of the environment. There's a lot of things we would have undone if we could have go back and repeat the Industrial Revolution on land. So we have a lot of lessons that we learn from that experience as we move into this blue acceleration, this emergence of a blue economy in the sea. It's our second rodeo, if you will, with industrial revolutions. And I think we all intend to get this one right in the oceans. There's a bunch of things that to leave us positioned, probably a number that my colleagues will talk about, leave us positioned to take on the challenges, to capitalize on the opportunities that this brand new acceleration of anthropogenic human activity in the oceans put in front of us, and to get it right this time around for this big important chunk of the planet with values. Just two things that I'll mention that are at our disposal now for an industrial revolution, if you will, for the oceans, or a brand new era of human relationship with the oceans. One, again, something I think we'll unpack a lot together, is that we have more data and more technology at our disposal to guide the unfolding of this acceleration, of this industrial revolution, than we ever had in past periods in our planet's history. And that matters. We can actually watch this thing unfold real time. We can shape how a revolution of new activity unfolds in the oceans real time. My group, my lab, very passionate about the use of technology, trying to shape ocean futures. If we get into it later, glad to share a few examples that are near and dear to my heart about leveraging the power of tech to shape positive change in the oceans. And the second thing that I'll mention that's different this time around for oceans and matters is that we got the memo, I think, or at least I hope we got the memo with the last industrial revolution, with this big period, hundreds of years of change that reformed our planet on land. We got the memo that some of that change creates disproportionate amount of burden for some of the most vulnerable people on the planet, especially that environmental change. And we don't want to recreate that inequity, recreate that kind of environmental justice when we redo a new industrial revolution, this time underwater on our planet. I think it matters to all of us that as we're thinking about how to use data, how to use science, how to use technology to help shape what the future becomes in the oceans, we also have everybody that needs to be involved in that conversation involved to shape that future, to make sure it comes out the way we want. So many things to unpack here together under the topic of opportunities and solutions. Really excited to hear thoughts from my colleagues. And Laura, I will pass the virtual mic back over to you to take us deeper into the conversation.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much, Doug. As you're listening to the speakers, you can go ahead and type your questions into the question box when they come to you, but we'll address all of the questions at the end of all four speakers. And so next I would like to introduce Ben Halpern, Professor of Marine Ecology and Conservation Planning at UCSB. Take it away, Ben.
Hi, Laura. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. In the spirit of Doug, I'll keep my comments brief and hopefully to the point, and look forward to the conversation at the end of this time to hear your thoughts as well.
Ben, so, your mic's a little bit foggy. Can you get closer, maybe?
Is that better? Can you hear me better?
Yeah. Much.
Sorry about that. So my journey in the oceans began like Doug, well, not fishing, but in the ocean, living near the coast and falling in love with scuba diving early on. So I knew I wanted to have a profession that my job took me into the ocean. So I got certified and spent my graduate career and beyond doing survey work on scuba in all sorts of lovely tropical environments around the world, and in the Caribbean, the Red Sea, Asia, and other places, Australia. And just as anyone who's been underwater in the tropics knows, it's magical and pulls you in. But perhaps ironically, at the start of my graduate school, I also joined a working group at the center I'm currently directing, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, NCES, that is founded on reusing data for new insights, so synthesizing existing information to kind of accelerate discovery in a way that can be more difficult when you need to go out and collect new data all the time. And actually Steve Gaines here was one of the leads of that group. So as a young graduate student, I got to join this group focused on kind of understanding the science of marine protected areas, what's known, where the gaps are, and how we can inform policy. And, you know, as a first-year graduate student, to be thrown in with the world leaders on marine protected area science and get to participate on that was truly transformative. And I got the bug of synthesis science as a tool in the scientist's toolkit for addressing problems, and quite literally never looked back. I did field work for another 10 years, but it kept petering out as the synthesis science took over my career. And I now I sit behind a desk a lot, but I look out on the ocean and remember the days that I was scuba diving. I'll get back there someday. But it's been really an interesting trajectory for me as I've moved from what was doing pure kind of marine ecology, studying fish population dynamics and what regulates their size, to more conservation focused work, and then more and more global scale work, trying to understand the drivers of change in the ocean and the solutions that we can bring to bear to address those pressures and threats to ocean health. And so I quickly moved beyond thinking about just fishing and just marine protected areas as issues, and tried to understand how things fit together to create kind of the overall set of pressures that influence ocean condition and what we can do about it. So kind of the first of two main points I want to leave you with, that's at the core of my research and areas that I think continue to need a lot of attention for understanding ocean health, is that if you focus on just one issue, you can miss the bigger picture. So really understanding the way that multiple stressors from many different human activities can have a cumulative impact on the ocean is a really important framing for understanding where threats lie and where opportunities exist for really strategic and impactful, sort of big bang for the buck strategies for mitigating solutions. And this mitigating pressure. So this works at any scale. So, you know, we've got climate change and overfishing and land-based pollution and invasive species and a whole range of other stressors that come from human activities that affect the state of the ocean. And you can look at that and answer questions at any scale of which of those pressures are the most important for driving overall condition in a particular location, and where you might have interactions between these stressors that could create synergies where the combination creates an outcome that's worse than just the sum of the parts, or cases where they actually mitigate each other, where a little bit of pollution nutrient pollution actually boosts productivity and makes the system more productive and more resilient to other stressors. So that the answers aren't always straightforward, but the importance of keeping many of these issues in mind and being addressed in how we think about managing ocean condition is really important. So my work has ranged all over the world and all over the map, literally, of mapping these stressors to try to understand where opportunities are and where some of the greatest threats are, where these hotspots of impact are, and where remaining pristine spots are that we might want to focus on protecting to preserve them in that condition moving forward. The second set of work that I'll mention, and then it's kind of a second point to raise, is really the need to measure what we want to manage. There's many people who have been attributed to this quote that you can't manage what you don't measure in finance, but also in conservation. And it's very true, certainly in ocean health. If you are trying to manage the oceans to be healthy, in a definition of health that can be broad across the many values that Doug spoke to that the oceans provide us, we need to be measuring these attributes and understand how much tourism is there, how many fish are we feeding, how much poverty are we alleviating, how many jobs are we creating, how much biodiversity is in the ocean, and so on. These are all really important attributes of ocean health. And if we aren't measuring these things, we don't know if or how well we are achieving these outcomes. So with a lot of colleagues over the last 10 years, we developed and launched the Ocean Health Index, which is a tool that helps us measure across these many different dimensions how oceans are doing globally for any given country and for regions within countries. We've been doing this for 9 years now. Next year will be our 10th year of doing this, and it allows you to start to track change, just like we look at measures of the Dow Jones Index for the health of aspects of our economy, or GDP is another measure of our economy, or you go to the doctor and get your annual physical. It tells you roughly how your health is doing. These are ways that we measure the health of other systems, of economies, of your human body. And with the Ocean Health Index, we can measure the health of this vibrant ecosystem and entity that is the ocean. So my work through these things has led into all sorts of things like the role of food in driving both the value and the impact we're having on the oceans, the potential for aquaculture to both feed the planet, provide some conservation value, but also as a potential pressure to the oceans, and so on. So it's been a really exciting and rich, diverse portfolio of work that this path has taken me down in my research, but it has left me with these two really key messages that I hope I can leave with you, that we need to be thinking about the big picture, the many different ways that we affect the oceans, and we need to be measuring these many attributes if we really want to be able to achieve the healthy ocean that we're striving for. Thanks, and I'll pass it back to you, Laura.
Fantastic, thank you, Ben. And maybe you could put the link to the Ocean Health Index in the chat box so people who aren't aware of it can check it out. And our next speaker is Chris Costello, who's a professor of resource economics at UCSB and also director of the Environmental Market Solutions Lab. So take it away, Chris.
Okay, thanks so much, Laura. Thanks to everybody for joining and for giving me an opportunity to speak. I think I'll provide a somewhat of a different perspective than Doug and Ben have. So, you know, if you're checking your email, you can come back to the program and hopefully I can tee up some interesting discussion points beyond what has already been raised. And I've been monitoring the chat and some really interesting questions have arisen, and one quick blanket statement is that all of those things are the things that the speakers on this call study, and we'd be happy to talk in as much depth as you'd like about any of those issues. Okay, so I guess I should start with my personal story, which is not nearly as interesting as a shark or being a commercial fisherman. I grew up in Davis, California, which is nowhere near the ocean. But I always loved the outdoors, kind of in my personal life, and in my, you know, I was a student and I always loved math and models and understanding human behavior. And those two things collided for me in this field called environmental economics, which is now what I do. So I'm trained as an economist, but all of my work is in the environment. And as Laura mentioned, I'm the director of something called the Environmental Market Solutions Lab. And MLab it's a nonprofit based at UCSB, and it's got economists and natural scientists in it. And our mission is to develop and implement market-based solutions to the world's most pressing environmental problems. And of course, many of those are in the ocean, and some of those have already come up in the chat. So, you know, basically what we do is we bring economics and natural science together to try to develop new kinds of solutions for ocean-based problems. So our work is not so much focused on trying to identify the size of a problem, where the big problems are in the ocean. We kind of take that research as given. What we think about are how can we solve those problems? And really we're paying special attention to the incentives around human behavior. We believe that solving problems in the ocean really means changing incentives for people so that they don't do as much of the bad thing and do more of the good thing. So what I'd like to do for just the few minutes that I have to speak with you today is to give you a few highlights of kind of how our group has been thinking about how this kind of market-based solutions approach can impact or can affect your thinking on strategic ocean investing or impact investing in the ocean. And so what I've done is I've got 3 points I'd like to make along those lines, and I'll try to make them as quickly as I can, and then maybe there can be some Q&A. The first point is one that Doug already emphasized to some extent, but it's that I think the ocean is an especially worthy candidate for impact investing. So if you're an impact investor and you kind of look around the world at places you could put your money, I think the ocean is a very worthy place to do that. And that's partly because it's this kind of enormous trove of ecosystem services, all the things Doug mentioned and more. But let me add a little color to that. Many of those ecosystem services in the ocean have been overexploited. This is the classic tragedy of the commons actually playing out in the ocean. And what that means, if you think about it kind of from an economic perspective, is that if we've depleted all those resources that we used to enjoy lots of benefits from, that suggests that there could be a large both economic and ecological upside from recovering those ecosystem services, from restoring ocean health. And lots of people, including our group, has tried to calculate, well, what is the benefit of restoring this part of the ecosystem versus that part of the ecosystem? So I think this first point that I want to make is that the kind of what I would call the ocean economy is really in its infancy. There's a huge potential upside, but we don't really quite know how to go grab it, how to facilitate it, and then actually make a profit off of it. So that brings me to my second point, which is that I think I'm going to try to make a case here that ocean impact investing, to do it well and to do it effectively, requires a different way of thinking, a new way of thinking compared to the tools that you're used to using for the investing in the rest of the economy. And the reason is that there just aren't that many investable assets in the ocean. If you think that a particular stretch, protecting a particular stretch of coastline in Brazil is going to create a lot of fish spillover and lots of biodiversity that's going to yield lots of benefits, you can't just go buy that stretch line of the coast in Brazil and preserve it. Whereas if you were on land, you could easily do that. And it's done every day by conservation groups like the Nature Conservancy. So the tools that you have at your disposal are quite different between land and sea. And you typically can't go buy a company and reform the way it does things to be more sustainable or have a triple bottom line like you could on land. So I'll kind of leave it at that, but just to say that there typically are not property rights, there typically are not prices and markets for the kinds of services that I and Doug talked about earlier. So that means that we're going to have to be clever about finding the right ways to invest in the ocean in terms of impact investing. And my third point kind of builds on that. And the third point is that I believe that a pretty large set of promising impact investment classes actually do exist in the ocean. They're just hard to find. And I want to just highlight two of them that I think are worth maybe discussing. And there are many, many others that I'd be happy to discuss with you after. So I'm now highlighting these two classes that I think are worth thinking about. The first one is to invest in innovations and technology and information provision that would help solve what I'm going to call market failures. So the market failures are things like when we lack information. For example, if we can't monitor fishing fleets in the world, we can't know when they're cheating or when they're catching too many fish or when they're fishing in a marine reserve or when they're engaging in human rights violations. So just investing in the technology to be able to visualize those fishing fleets, that helps correct a market failure. And that's one of 100 examples I could have just given. So thinking that that first class is like, let's correct market failures by investing in the right kinds of companies. And the second class I want to highlight is a little bit self-serving, but I'll do it anyway. And that is to support groups that are really thinking about policy and governance and science that can set the stage for better, more impactful investing in the future. So this would be, changing policies like carbon pricing for the ocean, or improved fisheries management, or marine protected areas, or waste recycling institutions. Someone had a chat about the Pacific, the garbage patch in the middle of the Pacific. Maybe the way to solve that isn't to go clean it up, but it's to provide new institutions on land for waste recycling. For example, that you could get paid for going and picking up trash. Maybe we wouldn't have such a big garbage patch if that was the case. So thinking about what these new institutions should be, and then working with the right kinds of governments or international agencies to implement these kinds of policies. And so I'll just kind of leave it at that and say that our research at MLab that I mentioned earlier, again, it's like right in your backyard here, but we have global reach. We're working on the kinds of problems that I think, many of the people on this call might be interested in. And we are entirely funded through philanthropy. So if you're interested in that kind of approach, the sort of market-based science plus economics approach, I would love to speak with you after. And so feel free to reach out if you'd like to get involved. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And we're getting lots of great questions rolling in, and I'm really looking forward to asking them of all of you. But we're first going to move to our final speaker, Steve Gaines, who is the Dean of the Bren School here at UCSB.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone for joining us for this discussion. To my own personal connection to the ocean actually has a lot of parallels to Doug. It just happened 20 years earlier. And a little bit further south along the Orange County coast, I spent an enormous amount of time in the water, basically avoiding how much development was going on on the land side of things, and just the freedom of being in the ocean. I also became a rabid fan of body surfing, which just gets you sucked into being in the ocean all the time. And then just really got hooked once I started scuba diving. And, from the standpoint of how that influenced my career is that, as Doug noted, the changes in the ocean that have happened pretty dramatically over the last 50 years compared to the pace of change of things that have happened on land. And so my time of experiencing the underwater world, I have seen a lot of these changes in terms of repeat visits to different places and the dramatic changes that have happened in terms of the abundance and changes in diversity and things along those lines. And when I started my first academic position, I was actually very much focused on trying to study how pristine natural ecosystems work, to really understand how the ecological system functions. And I specifically tried to find places where the human footprint was small, to really be able to understand how unimpacted ecosystems really function in interesting ways. But it didn't take me long to realize that was nuts, because every place I was working, and literally every problem I did for the first 10 years of my academic career, I ended up basically just documenting changes that were happening in the ocean in real time. And so I did a complete flip in my career about a third of the way through, where I started focusing obsessively on not just documenting problems, but actually thinking about how do we solve them? What does it take to actually solve these really complicated problems? So Doug gave a great introduction about the importance of the ocean. Ben gave a really nice overview about the critical value of actually characterizing its state and measuring the conditions and things like that. Chris started getting us focused on what it takes to really be driving solutions. And so I want to, and he gave some pathways that we can do that. And I want to continue on that and focus a little bit less on the kinds of specific things that I have done, but actually think about more the institutional side of this issue. At the Bren School, our philosophy for solving environmental problems is based on the amazing value that it brings to have teams of people with complementary skills work together on problem solving. And so within the school, we bring together people from key disciplines, economics, biology, law, business, to really think about how you can, the complementary things that those disciplines bring to the table can really help drive and create interesting solutions. But the other institutional structure that I think is incredibly important, and hopefully will be a part of the discussion today, is that these teams also need to include outside partners, outside of academia. This isn't just something where we study the problem at the university and then hope people use the interesting insights we come up with to go do something. We really need to develop strong partnerships with outside entities to help identify what the most important problems are, to create innovative solutions and get them implemented in a timely manner so that the solutions can start to grow faster than the problem. And so these pipelines, I think, are incredibly important for building a connection between academia and various implementers of change around the world. Now, we've had many successes over the last couple of decades with this kind of partnership mentality, in particular with governments and NGO partners. And I could talk about a lot of examples, but we had big influence on altering the general form of management for U.S. fisheries to make them more sustainable. We've helped implement the networks, large networks of marine protected areas in places like the Galapagos. And we've developed new, more sustainable business models for small scale fisheries in a variety of countries around the world, including the Philippines and Indonesia and Belize and many others. But scaling these kinds of solutions depends upon continued philanthropy and continued government funding with these kinds of partners. And yet, I think it's pretty clear that the funding of environmental NGOs, if we look at the adjusted for inflation, has leveled off after decades of rapid growth. And as we all know, government funding can be wildly unpredictable. And so depending upon just those two pathways and partnerships for scaling solutions in the ocean has its limits. The other is that these kinds of partnerships are particularly good for certain classes of solutions, but particularly policy solutions, but they're not really covering the whole range of opportunities. And so I think that there's huge untapped potential in building these kinds of partnerships with new ventures, solving environmental challenges in ways that are profitable. And so we have been looking at ways that we can greatly expand the potential for this new class of partnerships, which have happened in individual cases and in a small way, but I think the scope for potential is much, much bigger. And so one pathway that we've developed this is actually developing our own entrepreneurship program within the Bren School to train new entrepreneurs and help launch new ventures. And several of those over this decade have been in the marine space. But if we're going to really make change, I think we have to broaden the array of partners that we can be connecting these kinds of partnerships between academia and real world problem solvers. And so we're looking, for example, on campus to create a ocean innovation lab in a building on campus that we call COAST, the Center for Ocean Advancement in Science and Technology. It's a place where we hope that we can bring together like-minded innovators, entrepreneurs, philanthropists, policymakers, and researchers from across the campus, including the four of us on this call, to drive new advancements, to advance big data analytics and how we can use that to be driving new solutions, and to develop, as Chris noted, market-based environmental solutions to accelerate the kind of prudent investments in the ocean and its resources that we need to be making. So I think there's an enormous potential in place to facilitate these kinds of collaborations. And although the timing is obviously not great because of the lack of opportunities for new state funding right now to launch this kind of an innovation hub, I'm very optimistic we're going to get Coast off the ground soon. And I hope that this is something that we can have some discussions about today in terms of how we can build richer partnerships between universities and new ventures in terms of driving more scalable solutions to the ocean's problems. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve, and all of our panelists. And I think I'm the founding member of the Coast fan club, and I've made an investment in that already through my donor advised fund, and I'm just super excited. I think it's a much needed area of work, and often investors don't talk to scientists or policymakers, and so I'm super excited about it. And if anyone wants to join me in learning more about that, you can definitely reach me. And I have so many questions coming in. I had my own questions, but I think I'm gonna set those aside for the moment, although there's one I really want to ask. And I'm gonna start here at the top because I think Sharon Main has a really important question. And I think this is something maybe panelists other than Doug can respond to as well, which is agreeing that underrepresented groups and vulnerable populations have not been involved in shaping the economic constructs, and how are we involving these populations in the conversation now for the new ocean industrial revolution? So, I mean, maybe Doug can start, and others might want to weigh in as well.
Sure. Thanks, Laura, and thank you, Sharon, for that really good question. I have to say that when we all looked at the poster for the flyer, we realized together collectively the first thought for our speakers that we can't let the diversity that's represented in that flyer poster, our own faces, be representative of the leadership that we see for oceans in the future. And this is a core part of all our missions. I'll be brief because I know others, it's a really important passion area for each of us. And so maybe I'll just share one thought, which is that one thing that's a really happy thing for all of us is that UCSB is a center for diversity that is very different from the flyer for the talk. We're really privileged to have a huge amount of diversity, particularly in our undergraduate student body here. And now, I should say, we have a lot of ground to yet cover to make that the student population even more diverse in order to accurately represent diversity in California. And we all take that pipeline of diversity question very seriously. And maybe I'll just connect my one thought to something that we talked about, you mentioned, Laura, which is that for many people, connecting them to the oceans, for that matter, connecting them to ocean science, is just a matter of getting that one experience, whether it's that shark or whether it's body surfing or whatever everybody else shared. A lot of students who grow up in California are never really far from the oceans, but you still can, be from a community where you are either economically far or opportunity far from the oceans. Don't get those chances to get that kind of true immersion, I suppose, literally in the sea. One of the things we're trying to do now, obviously with a lot more vigor and a lot more strategy than as a result of all good conversations about diversity and inclusion on campus and all facets of our world, including oceans, is that we're starting a new program in the ocean science community here at UCSB, which is taking advantage of that diversity I mentioned on campus, actually creating a diversity program that will take students out to field sites in the oceans, including the first field site that you mentioned, Laura, to the Channel Islands, to get them underwater, snorkeling, seeing the values, hearing whale calls, get truly the salt into their blood from the oceans, and to get science into their blood, so they have that sense of exactly how to take that, well, both to see that passion and some sense of professionally what kind of skills they need to take that forward. I suppose we're throwing out, favorite opportunities that are deserving of attention. I'd say, we're catalyzing this program here on campus. A lot of us putting energy into it, getting first students into these field experiences. It's something we're looking to grow more of. So if it's an area of passion to you, you'll find all of us looking to accelerate and grow those kinds of programs. That's my one thought, getting more of the diversity here on campus out into the ocean and the field.
Thank you. And maybe if one other person wants to comment, this is a really important question. And there's also a lot of other questions coming in that I want to make sure we address too. So is there one other person that wants to
Say
comment
something
on this one?
briefly, Laura. I'll keep it very brief though. Just on the flip side to what Doug raises, really critically important, there's also the issue of how actions and solutions impact disadvantaged communities. And a lot of the work we've done in this team, and a rightfully so emerging interest in focusing science on better understanding how human actions and the solutions or policies that we take affect different communities differentially, is really having an important, I don't know if it's a renaissance or finally getting the attention it's due, but I think there's a lot of need and opportunity to support work that is doing that, and there's a lot of interest in helping do that. So there's an opportunity there for catalyzing like meaningful science to policy solutions through strategic investment as well. And there's a lot of interest in our community for trying to help make that happen.
Great, thank you, Ben.
Let me just, I know you want to move on, but I want to just add one quick thing to what Ben just said. So Doug talked about what he's doing, or what is being done right here in your backyard to involve more people. Ben talked about, how do we find the impact of policies differentially on different communities. And another way to think about that is, how do you design, as we design interventions in the ocean, how do we design them so that they are more equitable? And for example, allocating rights instead of to the people that have fished the most in the past, can you allocate rights to communities or indigenous groups or women to increase empowerment of communities that have been found to be historically underrepresented? So I think it's not just about finding the problem, and I know Ben's all about the solution as well, and I just wanted to kind of highlight that aspect of his response.
Great point, thank you so much. And let's see, Linda has a question about, and this might be for either Chris or Steve, is how to address the economic needs of fishermen and not deplete fish to dangerous levels. And I know this is something both of you have spent a lot of time thinking about.
What a beautiful way to ask the question. It's like perfectly posed. I'll give one answer, and Steve, Steve and I usually agree, but he usually finds something that I'm doing wrong, and he's my boss, so he gets to bat last. So here, I guess the essence of my answer is going to be that it turns out, I'm an economist and I can tell you this with certainty, the best way to make money in a fishery is to have a healthy fish stock, period. So it turns out that in the long run, profitability and sustainability go hand in hand in fisheries. And that's different than like in climate change, for example, where polluting firms would love to be able to pollute as much as they possibly can, and it's citizens that get hurt from that. In fisheries, it's all internal. Fishermen only hurt themselves when they overfish, but it's just a timing problem. In the short run, it makes sense to fish harder. In the long run, that depletes fish stocks. So what our group has really focused on is, how do you create incentives so that long run view can be internalized by those fishermen in the short run, so that it isn't a trade-off, like your question suggests. They would then see under those new institutions that the best thing to do is to conserve the fish stock today. And that's not just hypothetical. We've actually gone around, and now about 25% of the world's fish catch comes from those kinds of fisheries that have implemented the rules where that now makes sense. I'll leave it at that. I know that was a bit cryptic, but maybe Steve can clean it up.
No, it's a great job. Just, I think just to emphasize the point that Chris made before, that the way you can do this is if you give, for example, exclusive access rights to a group of fishers, it changes their opportunity to take action to where the long-term benefits are something that they're willing to actually go after, even though it might take 5 years before they realize them. The fact that they're going to be the ones that achieve those benefits is an action that they'll take. And so a lot of the small scale fishery solutions that we have talked about, that we have been able to implement this kind of a thing. And the responses are amazing in terms of how much more effective local communities can manage their fishery and make more money and have more fish in the water.
Thank you both. I'm just going to throw this question out there because, well, actually, one comment I'm going to make, because I know he's on the line, is Chris Gallo with UBS. They did a wonderful guide on See Beyond the Blue, a guide for ocean philanthropists and change makers. And so a lot of you who are asking about ocean philanthropy may be interested in that. So he can put the link hopefully in the chat box, or I can if he doesn't have it handy. And another question, I've been thinking about this a lot and sort of just learning about it, but blue bonds, can one of you talk about blue bonds? It seems like that's such a clever way to invest in the ocean and in countries that may be struggling to pay off debt. And I know the Nature Conservancy has a program where they're doing that. I don't know if that's open more broadly to other investors or will be, but maybe one of you can comment on that. I'm super interested in that.
Steve, do you want to take that?
I thought that was more in your.
Okay, I'm happy to. I mean, I agree that blue bonds are really promising. I think there are still a lot of unanswered questions about measurement and, you know, ensuring that the payoff actually happens in the way that you think it's going to, the environmental payoff, that is. And, you know, what it really comes down to is, as I mentioned earlier, and actually Doug and Ben also touched on this, you know, if we don't price things in the ocean, then fundamentally there's no way to capture the benefit of, you know, recovery. And blue bonds provide a mechanism to do that. And so for that reason, I think they're really promising. But I think there's a lot of other vehicles that can achieve that same goal in different ways. So I wouldn't put all my stock, so to speak, in blue bonds, but I do think that's you know, an emerging and promising vehicle.
Great. And we have a question from Matt Riley. Steve, can you provide a couple of examples of private industry or capital partnering with other groups to achieve successful endeavors or outcomes?
Yeah, so you know, I think that there are a number of ways that these kinds of partnerships that I was talking about can really be beneficial. So one is by really being able to do kind of the environmental accounting, how for a variety of different kinds of proposed new ventures, what's the likely environmental impact going to be? And so that's something where, so for example, several of our colleagues do something called life cycle assessment, which is basically an accounting mechanism to really be able to look at the environmental footprint, both the positive and negative side of a variety of different actions. And so that's something that we've started to do, for example, with a number of entities that are interested in new aquaculture models that might be able to sequester carbon and have climate change benefits, for example. So we've developed a formal framework to evaluate how big the expected benefit would be from different ways that they might be able to grow aquaculture, as a perfect example. The other side is something that Chris has done some really interesting things on, which is forecasting changes in the future and what are going to be the bottlenecks that actually might limit some environmental benefits that could come from a different kind of action. So for example, we've heard several people talk about the potential for aquaculture to play a much bigger role in the future in terms of meeting the demand for animal protein on the planet. Big food security kinds of benefits, but it also has huge climate benefits because of the fact that a unit of protein from aquaculture tends to be about 1/10 or less of the same amount of carbon emissions from a similar unit of protein from land-based protein. But what Chris's analysis has showed is, for example, how one of the biggest constraints for fed aquaculture is the fact that we feed them today ground up fish from wild fisheries, and there's only so much of that. And so he's done a really nice analysis that shows what's the benefit of new innovations in feed for aquaculture and how much of a scaling opportunity that opens by new kinds of innovation. So those are two examples of the kinds of collaborations where I think the analytical types of work that we can do in academia can play really complementary roles with new ventures.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I know we're kind of getting close on our time here, but I wanted to end on just a really positive note while we have all of you here. And maybe you can just give, a sentence or two, but what gives you hope about the future of the ocean in the time we're in right now? And so I know both Chris and Doug have to jump off right at 2. So let's start with Chris, and then we'll move to Doug, and then Ben and Steve.
Listen, I'm a hopeful person, and I think when I look out at the ocean, I see and others I'm sure disagree, but a better ocean today than we had, let's say, 20 years ago, at least with respect to fisheries and a lot of aspects related to fisheries. There are other things like plastics that are a lot worse. So I see forward progress on margins that, we previously thought were a complete disaster. That's hope point number 1. Hope point number 2 is I just saw that Governor Newsom signed an executive order today on ocean health and nature-based solutions in the ocean. And, I think there's just a lot of momentum, not just here, but in many parts of the world towards, improving ocean health because we realize these ecosystem services that it provides. So I'm hopeful, and I'm glad that you're all here, and I think we can do this together.
Thank you. How about you, Doug?
Great, yeah, and a great thought, Chris. Yeah, I would say that I do see an immense amount of urgency and opportunity. I often think, probably like a lot of you do, what's the next 10 years or even what's the next 50, 100 years going to bring for the oceans? I think we're in a pretty stable place right now, but I think we have some really big decisions, some really influential decisions to make in the next several decades that'll shape what the next century of the oceans actually becomes. And there are a lot of different paths that we might walk down, not all of them that I would want to share with my kids. But I think to get that right, I think we have a couple of really important things. This is maybe the same things that I was suggesting earlier as our key assets. One, technology, just to, you get the sense through a few of the things we built using tech tools up in the text box there, a new detector for trying to prevent ships from running over whales, a new global system for capturing plastic in rivers. We have a bunch of things we just love trying to innovate around technology to try to fix ocean problems. And UCSB is all about getting their hands dirty and taking tech and science to try to actually apply and fix problems. But the technology and the innovation around technology is moving so fast, not so much in ocean science, but in your world and innovation in sectors for industry. But we're able to borrow some of those tools and parasitize some of that momentum to do some really cool and some really important things with ocean problem solving. And then the second thing, in addition to tech, by far our best machine are our humans. And that's our humans on campus I mentioned earlier, and all of you. And I think being in this place, we really can invest in making sure that we're building out more involvement and building out a wider net of these really important stakeholders in who are going to inherit that 100-year future that we're talking about. I'm taking that seriously, and I see more of us taking that seriously. Gives me a lot of hope that we're going to get to 2100 with the oceans in just the way that we must and just the way we all want to. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks so much. I don't know if Ben or Chris, or if you're still there, do you have anything? I've lost you from my screen. Ben or Steve, I'm sorry.
I'll be very brief. I'll just say the thing that gives me hope is I think the oceans are incredibly resilient and it's not too late, whereas other systems it might be so. Whereas I think we have a window of opportunity. It's not yet closed, and if we act boldly in the next decade, I think we can make huge differences and the oceans will recover. So I remain very hopeful.
Thank you.
And I'll end it. What gives me hope is that we're surrounded. So in our case, we have 250 graduate students that their entire passion for their career is solving these problems. And literally every day I hear really innovative ideas that come out of these young, passionate minds. And so that's what keeps me really positive, is there's lots of innovation coming out of young, talented students right now.
Thank you all so much for those wonderful thoughts, and what gives me hope is conversations like this one that we're having today, and kind of connecting the dots between all sorts of people who have a passion and love for the ocean. So thanks so much for joining and for the opportunity. And thank you, Steve and Chris and Doug and Ben, for all of your expertise.
Thanks,
Thank you, Laura.
everyone.
Yeah.
All right.